everybody, welcome to the Jayda Stitches show. We are halfway through the year. It's hard to believe, but 2017 is completely cut in half. We've done half of our 2017 calendar blanket, and a lot of you are starting to ask questions about how we're going to put it together, whether you can do it as you go, if you have to wait until the very end until you have all 12 squares, and so I thought we would address some of those questions today. And I'm also going to share with you how I am joining my squares up for the 2017 calendar blanket. Now we have a tutorial on 3 different ways to join your square motifs together. We'll put the link for that down in the description box below. And you can use any one of the 3 that we have specified in that tutorial because they'll all work with this blanket setup. I am using the sewing method for a couple reasons. One, sewing uses less yarn than crochet. And this is a yarn heavy project, so I have how much yarn I'm using in the back of my head at all times. So that's why number one, I'm sewing mine together. And number 2, if for some reason your blocks become separated or something comes unraveled when later down the road you've been using it, when you've sewn your blocks together, I find that it's a little easier to mend those spaces so you're not trying to recrochet something in between. So that's another reason I like sewing. But like I said, you can use any of the methods that you like. So that's the sewing. We're going to show you a couple of tips for sewing, or at least joining as you go along, once we jump into this video. And of course we're going to show you how the blanket is looking so far. As many of you have probably figured out, I am making 2 of these calendar blankets because for every motif video I have 1 square made, and then I show you how to make the square, so we make 1 together. So I end up with at least 2 of every block, and some of them, like the bunnies, I wind up with more because I love the little motif so much that I want to try it in different colors because I'm not sure which one I'm going to include in my final blanket. So yeah, lots to consider. Anyway, we're going to address those questions today, so let's hop on over to the craft table and we will get into the assembly of this calendar blanket. We are sewing together our calendar blanket squares. So for this part of the project, you need the same yarn that you've bordered your squares with. For me, that's white acrylic worsted weight size 4 yarn. You want a pair of scissors and a yarn needle. We don't need a crochet hook. We're going to be sewing our blanket squares together in strips. And since each row is going to be 3 squares across, you want the first 3 squares of your year. So for us, that's January, the snowman, February, the teddy bear, and March, the leprechaun hat. So grab those 3, that's what we're going to start with. We're going to sew them together in pairs. So the first 2 we're going to sew together are January and February, and we're going to sew the seam that borders them both. Grab your long yarn, so grab some yarn. I'd say cut yourself about 24 inches or 60 centimeters, enough that you're going to have to sew up that whole edge, and you won't necessarily have to tie any extra yarn in as you go, because I find that's kind of annoying. So a nice long length of yarn. Grab your yarn needle, you can thread up your yarn, and we're going to tie a knot to anchor our yarn on the actual squares. So you can put your squares right sides together or wrong sides together, it doesn't matter, but you want to be consistent throughout. So I don't mind doing mine right sides showing or wrong sides together. So I'm going to pick them both up and I'm going to hold them so that the seam I'm sewing is upright. So I'm looking at it. And then I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to find the stitch on either side of the first shell. So this would be one of the corner chains. I'm going to pick up the corner chain. So the actual chain, you see I've run my needle right through it. So the one on one side and the corresponding one on the other. So there we go. They're both now on my needle. I'm going to pull my yarn almost all the way through, leave myself some tail, and I'm going to tie a knot. So I'm going to double knot this. I want to make sure it doesn't come undone. And then I'm going to go back in and I'm going to thread in that tail or weave it in later. So I'm going to just start sewing. This is how I like to sew my granny square edges together. I hold it by the space. So you see I've got my fingers through the spaces that correspond with each other. So I'm only looking at 3 stitches at a time, or a shell at a time. Because we've already knotted our yarn together through those 2 corner edge chains, the next set is the first of each of the stitches in that shell. So there's the first one on either side. So make sure your needle passes through them both, and that's your first stitch. I'm still holding it between in that space so that I'm only looking now at the next 2, and that helps me not miss any stitches. You don't want to get to the end of a seam and realize your blanket squares are out of alignment with each other. That is really annoying, and then you've got to take out your threads and you've got to figure out where you went wrong. So we don't want to do that. So now that I've done 2, that means I've got 1 set each left in that shell, and that's the first shell put together. You see I'm still nice and even. Now I want to do that set of chains that separate each of the shells. So there's the 1 and 2, and I'm going through, I'm going to show you this, I'm going through the chain. So the bottom loop of the chain is underneath my needle, and the top 2 loops are on the top of my needle. And that's the chains. I move my fingers to the next set of spaces so that I highlight just those 3 stitches, and I can easily see them and I can stitch through them. Using this little approach to holding the spaces with your fingers actually helps you sew a lot quicker, because you're only worrying about sets of 3 at a time. Sets of 3, sets of 3, sets of 3. You finish a set of 3, and then you do the 2 chains in between those shells. Then you move your fingers to the next set, and so on. So go ahead, sew up that first seam, and I'll catch you at the end. Once you've worked all the way across, you've finished your last shell set. The last stitch you make should be through the chain on either side of that last shell set. So the first chain leading into your corner. Now I like to go through this one twice. So I make a stitch twice through the same set of chains, just so I know that it's secure. Then I knot off. So I use that same loop to create a knot. Now if you've got really slippery yarn, you might want to knot that twice. Otherwise, I flip it to the wrong side and I weave in my tail a little bit. So I just find a few stitches across the back. And I weave it back and forth a few times. And then I go find that little short tail that I started with, and I weave it in the same way, because I don't want any of my little tails to show, and I don't want them to come out. So there. I go back to the beginning, I find my little tail, and I weave in it as well. And that is the first seam done. You see how both of my squares are in alignment. All of the shells line up nice and neat, so do the spaces, and the tops and bottoms are straight, so they're not crooked. Now you grab the third square in that row, and that one would be March, and you do the same thing. Thread up your yarn, start right at the corner. If you're working wrong sides together like I am, then you continue working wrong sides together. Your first stitch is through those 2 chains that are the beginning of that corner. Oops, look at that, I grabbed the wrong one. There. Aha. So that chain on the chain on either side of each shell set, that's the first place that you join your yarn, you knot it up, and then continue just blocking off little sets of 3 as you go. So go ahead, work that edge, and I'll see you at the end of that seam. And there's the next seam together. So that is all 3 of my squares for row 1 all together now, all evenly sewn together, and the tops are flat and the bottoms are flat. That is row 1. Put that aside. Now you want your next 3 squares that will be April, May, and June. You're going to sew them together in the same way. Start with the first two at the beginning of the row, and then add the second one, or the third I should say, that would be your second seam. And sew all three of those together, and then we're going to put our rows together afterwards. All right, there's my second row sewn together, April, May, and June. Once you have a whole row sewn together, and another whole row sewn together, you can sew together 2 strips. So I'm going to treat these the same way that I do my blocks. I'm going to start at the January and April squares. I'm going to put them wrong sides together. Turn my whole blanket around here. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start with the corner chain on either edge of the shells, and we're going to work in sets of 3. So you want to cut yourself a long string, long enough that you think it'll work itself all the way across this long row. If you have to knot it in the middle, it's okay. Give yourself, lay your ends together like this and knot them together, and then you can weave the long tails in as you go. It's not a big deal, and the knots don't really show, especially if all of this is the same color. So go ahead, cut yourself a length, and we'll get sewing. All right, I've knotted my yarn in the 2 corner chains. I'm holding it by the first space, and I'm going to start. There's my first set. Now this is a long string, so when you first start with a long string, it takes you a while to pull it all the way through. I'm going to go ahead and weave in my little tail later, so I'm going to keep that out of the way. And I'm going to work steadily across the whole row, working the same sets of stitches together and the same sets of chains together. So once you get to a space, you want to get those 2 chains. If you've got a little join, beware of your joins from your previous rows when you made your squares. It doesn't interrupt your, there's the chain, but the join's right next to it. You just want to make sure you get the stitch and not interrupt that little knot off that you finished a row with. Okay, so you can go ahead, do the same technique all the way across to the first transition between squares, and I'll show you what I like to do when I get to that point. We're nearing the first transition between squares. So to break it down, I've stitched together the last set of shells on my first set of squares, and now I'm at a transition point. So I want to make sure that I get the chains, so I put a stitch through the chains on either side of those shells. So the first chain leading into the corner of the squares. I'm going to skip over the join, and I'm going to pick up the next set of chains on either side of the shells on the next set of squares. So this little join here, where I've sewn together those 2 sets of squares, I'm going to skip it. I'm going to pop right over top of it. Because I don't want to put too much weight on the stitches that I've knotted off. So I'm just hopping over top. You can see that there's a long stitch right there. The nice thing about using the same color for border for all your squares is that when you sew them all together, you don't really see your stitches. It just looks like part of the overall stitching. And once you've skipped over that and worked the stitch between the first chains on either side of that first set of new shells, you can just continue. So you work the first set of shells, and when you get to the space, you do the same thing. Pick up those chain ones, and then move your fingers to the next set of spaces and continue. You can continue right across, and that is the first seam between rows of our 2017 calendar blanket. And that is how I am going to assemble my squares for the 2017 calendar blanket. Please feel free to do it exactly the same way I have, or you can use either of the other 2 methods that are mentioned in that other joining tutorial, and we'll put the link for that in the description box down below. Another another note, if you are in a different hemisphere, so for our InStitches family down in New Zealand and Australia, and you want to put your blocks together in a way that is more representational of the kind of year you're having, so for example, if you build snowmen in July and August, where we build snowmen in January and February, please feel free to mix your blocks around. So you might want to wait a little bit before you put all your blocks together, or you may have 3 in a row that you know are perfect and you can start assembling them at any time. Just remember that every single row is 3 squares, and eventually you'll have 4 rows of square motifs in your calendar blanket. So now you can wait until the next 3 squares are made, and you can sew all them together and add that row, and then the last set will be October, November, and December, and then we'll be able to put the whole thing together and we'll put a border on. But that is yet to come, because we are still only halfway through 2017. Let's not wish away the year. Anyway, that's it so far on the Jayda InStitches show for the 2017 calendar blanket. A special thanks to everyone who has popped over to our Etsy shop lately. As a special reminder, we have all of those motifs, so all the squares for the 2017 calendar square blanket up for sale, the patterns that is, in our Etsy shop. So please feel free to pop over and take a look if you haven't already. And we will see you again soon on the Jayda InStitches show. Until then, stay safe, stay crafty, and have a great week. Bye!